What led to the rift between Peter and Paul in Antioch, and to what extent did this change the direction of Christianity?
I think part of what it does, let me back up. The rift comes in that, as Paul tells it in Galatians at least, that it had been acknowledged that he and Barnabas would engage in the mission to the Gentiles, and provided that they would continue, though, to support the church in Jerusalem. And of course, part of what he wants to do is raise funds to send back and support the people in the church in Jerusalem. But one of the points that he brings up, that he challenges Cephas, or Peter, is that Peter seemed to not engage in Jewish dietary practices when he was among the Gentiles. But as soon as perhaps representatives from Jerusalem, a part of what's sometimes called the circumcision party, show up, he immediately, caves in, as it were. That would be sort of Paul's critique, that instead of just carrying on the way he had been, he adopts and conforms to the Jewish dietary laws.
But I thought the delegation from Jerusalem frowned on his eating with Gentiles.
Exactly. And you see this coming out both in Acts and in Galatians. But in Galatians, Paul says, look, I confronted Cephas and I said, essentially, why are you being a hypocrite? Why when you were with the Gentiles, you were free to, act like a Gentile. But then when the folks from Jerusalem show up, then you withdraw from them. And that is, that you're failing to recognize that their faith is not dependent, or that their salvation, their being a disciple of Christ, is not dependent on the obedience to the law, but based on faith in Christ. And so that becomes part of the split between Paul and Peter. Though to say that though the fact that Paul is continuing to send resources back to Jerusalem reflects that he has an ongoing sense of connection between his work and the work in Jerusalem. I mean, and very often you see, if you trace Paul's trips, they don't all originate from Jerusalem, but there is a connection with Jerusalem that remains. What I think this becomes so significant because it really redefines what it means to be a Christian vis-a-vis the Mosaic law. And that is that the Mosaic law is binding on Christians in terms of moral teachings. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not covet. All of those are still binding on Christians. But the ceremonial law, such as the dietary laws and circumcision, are not binding on Christians. And therefore, there was a way in which early Christians looked upon those ceremonial practices as symbols, types that pointed to the coming of Christ. But once Christ came, you no longer needed those because, you had been relying on the type, but the fulfillment of the type was already here. Therefore, you didn't need to go to practice the Passover. You didn't need to have animal sacrifices. Certainly the destruction of the temple meant that if the temple's gone and you can't perform the sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins, you can't fulfill the Mosaic law. So for Jews, it became the focus shifted from ritual to a highly, to faithfulness through ethical observance. Whereas for Christians, the focus became not on Moses, but on Abraham as the example of faith that justifies. And that, of course, becomes a central component of all subsequent faith. And one of the things that later Christian theologians say in the 4th century, and I'm thinking of one fellow by the name of Ambrose, who was Bishop of Milan, made the point that Christians observe the faith of Israel. And by the faith of Israel, he meant the faith of Abraham, which was justified, by which he was justified before God. And so that, and because he was justified by his faith, independent of and before the law, so too Gentiles were not obliged to obey the ceremonial law, but could be justified simply because they believed in the promises of Christ and then lived according to the life of the Spirit.